Hi everyone, I'm your storyteller, here to assist you today. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep, but before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know where you're from and what time are you watching. Now, settle in and unwind. The house at the edge of the woods. It started with a whisper. On the outskirts of a quiet town that most maps forgot, there was a house older than anyone could remember. Some said it had been there since before the town was founded, its foundations laid by hands long turned to dust. Others said it had simply appeared one morning, rising from the mist like a wound in the earth. No one had lived in it for decades, or so people claimed. But the windows always seemed to glimmer with a faint, pale light after sundown, and those who dared wander too close swore they heard voices murmuring within. Ellie didn't believe in ghost stories. At 16, she was too old for childish fears and too practical to believe in curses. So when her family moved into the old house, mostly because it was the only home her parents could afford, she rolled her eyes at the warnings from the locals. "Don't stay past dark," the grocer said when Ellie and her mom had stopped for supplies. He was an older man with skin like creased paper and a voice like gravel. "It's not safe." Ellie had laughed. "We live there now? I think we'll be staying past dark." The man's expression darkened. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The house doesn't like visitors." The first night in the house was uneventful, though Ellie's little brother, Sam, swore he heard someone walking in the attic above his room. "It's just the old wood settling," their dad had said, brushing off Sam's concerns. Houses this old make noises. Ellie wasn't so sure. She hadn't heard footsteps, but there was something about the house that felt off. The air inside was cold, even though it was the middle of summer, and the silence seemed heavier than it should have been, as though the house itself were listening. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, and in some places the designs seemed to twist and shift when she looked at them too long. But she told herself it was just her imagination. That night, as Ellie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought she heard something, just faint enough that she couldn't be sure if it was real. A whisper, a soft, sibilant sound, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. She sat up, straining to hear, but the sound stopped. The house was silent again. "Get a grip, Ellie," she muttered to herself, pulling the blanket over her head. She was too old to be scared of the dark. But the whisper came back. It was closer this time, and though she couldn't make out the words, she could feel them, brushing against her mind like cold fingertips. She pressed her hands to her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. "It's just the wind," she told herself. Just the wind. Morning couldn't come fast enough. By the second day, Ellie's nerves were frayed. She hadn't slept well, and every creak of the floorboards set her teeth on edge. Sam, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He was already exploring the house, poking his head into closets and cupboards, declaring each new discovery with the excitement only a 10-year-old could muster. "Ellie, look!" he shouted, holding up an old dust-covered toy he'd found in the attic. It was a wooden horse, its paint chipped and faded, with one wheel missing from its base. "It's cool, right?" Ellie wrinkled her nose. "It's junk." "It's vintage," Sam corrected, grinning. "I'm keeping it." She didn't argue. Let him have his creepy old toy. She had bigger things to worry about, like the strange feeling she got every time she walked past the upstairs hallway. It felt colder there, and she couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was watching her. She told herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't bring herself to linger in that part of the house. That night, the whispering came back. This time, it wasn't just in her room. It was everywhere. She could hear it in the walls, in the floors, in the ceiling. 100 voices, all speaking at once, their words tangled and incomprehensible. She pulled the blanket over her head, trembling, but the whispers grew louder, pressing against her skull. And then they stopped. Ellie sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was silent again, but the air felt heavier, like the moment before a storm. She glanced toward the door and froze. A shadow was standing in the hallway. It was tall and thin, its edges blurred like smoke, and though it had no eyes, Ellie could feel its gaze boring into her. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadow took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Ellie wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard. The shadow reached the doorway, its form blotting out the faint light from the hallway. And then it was gone. The next morning, Ellie told her parents what she'd seen, but they dismissed it as a nightmare. "You've been under a lot of stress with the move," her mom said, patting her shoulder. "It's normal to have bad dreams." "It wasn't a dream," Ellie insisted. "I saw it, but no one believed her. Not her parents, not Sam, not even herself. Not really. Maybe it was just a trick of the light," she thought. Or maybe she was overtired. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with the house. That afternoon, Sam came running downstairs, his face pale. "Ellie! Mom! Dad! You have to see this!" he shouted. They followed him upstairs, where he led them to a small door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Ellie frowned. She hadn't noticed the door before, even though she'd walked past that spot a dozen times. "It's a secret room," Sam said, grinning. He opened the door, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. "Careful," their dad said. "It might not be safe." But Sam was already halfway down the stairs. Ellie hesitated, then followed him, her heart pounding. The air grew colder as they descended, and the faint smell of damp earth filled her nose. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a small table, and on the table was a book. Ellie stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. The book was old, so old that the leather cover was cracked and brittle. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed the surface, a sharp jolt ran up her arm, and she yanked her hand back. "What was that?" she whispered, staring at the book. It felt alive. Sam leaned in, peering at the faded lettering on the cover. "I think it's a diary," he said. "Look, there's a name." Ellie squinted at the letters, barely legible through the grime. "Eliza Grayson," she read aloud. "Who's that?" "I don't know," Sam said, flipping the book open. The pages were filled with cramped handwriting, the ink faded with age. "But I bet she has some stories to tell." Ellie watched as Sam flipped through the diary, his eyes wide with fascination. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, as though the person who wrote it had been in a hurry, or afraid. "Read it out loud," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't sure why she wanted to hear it. Something about the book made her skin crawl, but she couldn't look away. Sam cleared his throat and began reading. June 3rd, 1892. "The house is alive. I hear it in the walls, in the floors. It whispers to me when I sleep. It shows me things I cannot unsee. I am afraid to close my eyes now, for when I do, I see them, the ones who came before me. They scream and claw at the edges of my dreams. They are trapped here, just as I am." Sam paused, looking up at Ellie. "This is creepy," he said with a nervous laugh, but Ellie didn't respond. Her stomach churned as though she'd swallowed ice. She motioned for him to keep reading. June 10th, 1892. "I found the door today. It was hidden behind the wardrobe in the upstairs hall. I do not know how I missed it before. It seems impossible that I could have walked past it so many times without seeing it. I should have left it closed, but I opened it, and now I cannot undo what I've done. The house is angry." Sam stopped again, his face pale. "Do you think she means this room?" he asked, glancing around at the dusty shelves and the narrow staircase behind them. Ellie didn't answer. She stepped closer to the table, staring down at the diary. Her fingers itched to turn the pages herself, but she didn't dare touch it again. "Keep going," she said, her voice trembling. Sam hesitated, then flipped to another page. The handwriting here was even more erratic, the letters slanting wildly across the paper. June 15th, 1892. "The shadows move when I am not looking. They gather in the corners of the room, watching, waiting. I can feel them pressing against my mind, whispering things I do not understand. I tried to leave the house today, but the door would not open. The windows will not break. I am a prisoner here." Sam's voice cracked on the last word. He closed the book with a trembling hand and looked at Ellie. "I don't like this," he said. "Let's go back upstairs." Ellie nodded, but as they turned to leave, she thought she heard something, a faint rustling sound, like fabric brushing against the walls. She froze, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Sam shook his head. "Hear what?" Ellie turned back toward the table, her eyes scanning the shadows in the corners of the room. For a moment, she thought she saw something move, a flicker of darkness, gone almost as soon as it appeared. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. "Come on," Sam said, tugging at her sleeve. "Let's go." They hurried up the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Ellie didn't look back, but she could feel something behind her, something cold and heavy and watching. When they reached the top, Sam slammed the door shut and twisted the lock. "Don't tell Mom and Dad," he said, his voice shaking. "They'll say we're making it up." Ellie nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they'd just made a terrible mistake. For the next few days, Ellie tried to avoid the hidden door at the end of the hallway. She tried to tell herself that the diary was just an old story, that the strange things she'd seen and heard were just her imagination. But the house wouldn't let her forget. The whispers came back every night, louder than before. Sometimes they sounded like words, though she couldn't understand them. Other times they were just a low, droning hum that seemed to vibrate through her bones. She started keeping her bedroom light on, but it didn't help. The shadows were still there, lurking just outside the circle of light. Sam seemed fine, though. He'd taken to carrying the old wooden horse around with him, as though it were a good luck charm. Ellie couldn't understand why he wasn't scared. Maybe he just didn't hear the whispers. Or maybe he was better at pretending they weren't real. One afternoon, Ellie decided to do some exploring of her own. She waited until her parents were busy unpacking boxes and Sam was playing outside, then crept down the hallway toward the locked wardrobe. It stood at the end of the hall, its dark wood polished to a dull sheen. Ellie had always thought it was just a piece of furniture, but now she wasn't so sure. She reached out and grasped the handle. It was cold to the touch, and when she pulled, the door didn't budge. She tried again, harder this time, but it was no use. The wardrobe was locked. Ellie frowned. She crouched down, peering at the thin gap between the doors. For just a moment, she thought she saw something move inside, something small and quick, like a spider scurrying out of sight. She jerked back, her heart pounding. "Ellie?" She spun around, nearly screaming, but it was just Sam. He was standing in the hallway, the wooden horse clutched in his hands. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice suspicious. "Nothing," Ellie said quickly. "Go back outside." Sam didn't move. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "You're trying to open it, aren't you?" "The wardrobe." Ellie hesitated, then nodded. "I think there's something inside." "There's nothing in there," Sam said. "It's just a stupid old wardrobe." "Then why is it locked?" Ellie shot back. Sam shrugged, but he looked uncomfortable. "You shouldn't mess with it," he said. "What if it's like cursed or something?" Ellie rolled her eyes. "You don't believe in curses." "Yeah, well," Sam trailed off, clutching the wooden horse tighter. "Just leave it alone, okay?" Ellie sighed. "Fine, whatever." But she didn't mean it. That night, Ellie couldn't sleep. The whispers were louder than ever, filling her room with a chorus of disjointed voices. She pressed her pillow over her ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside her head now, crawling through her thoughts like worms. When she couldn't take it anymore, she got out of bed and crept into the hallway. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards under her feet. She made her way to the wardrobe, her heart hammering in her chest. This time, she brought a flashlight. She shone the beam into the thin gap between the doors, but all she could see was darkness. She tried the handle again, pulling with all her strength, but it still wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she stepped back. There had to be a way to open it. Maybe the key was somewhere in the house. She thought about the diary they'd found in the hidden room. If Eliza Grayson had lived here, maybe she'd had the key. Ellie turned and made her way back to the hidden door. She hesitated for only a moment before unlocking it and descending the narrow staircase. The room at the bottom was just as cold and dark as before, but she forced herself to step inside. The diary was still on the table. Ellie picked it up, flipping through the pages. Most of it was unreadable, the ink smudged or faded, but near the back she found a drawing. It was a crude sketch of a key, its shape jagged and unusual. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "The key is hidden where the shadows gather." Ellie frowned. What did that mean? Shadows were everywhere in this house. How was she supposed to find one specific spot? She stood there for a long moment, staring at the drawing, and then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something move. The shadows in the corner of the room shifted, swirling like smoke. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, the shadows began to stretch toward her, their edges curling like fingers. She dropped the diary and ran. Ellie didn't stop running until she was back in her room, slamming the door shut behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she leaned against the door, struggling to catch her breath. She told herself it was just her imagination, just a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew better. The shadows had moved. They had reached for her. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing louder. Ellie pressed her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house wouldn't let her leave. She didn't sleep that night. When the first rays of sunlight crept through her window, she finally felt brave enough to leave her room. The house was quiet now, the heavy silence broken only by the distant sound of birds chirping outside. For a brief moment, Ellie allowed herself to believe that everything was normal. Then she saw Sam. He was sitting at the kitchen table, the wooden horse clutched in his hands. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed as though he'd been crying. Ellie froze in the doorway. "Sam?" she said cautiously. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared down at the horse, his fingers tracing the chipped paint. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I saw her." Ellie's blood ran cold. "Saw who?" Sam looked up at her, his eyes wide with fear. "The lady in the shadows." Sam's words hung in the air like a curse. Ellie sat down across from him, her hands trembling. "What do you mean, you saw her?" she asked. "She was in my room last night," Sam said, his voice shaking. "I woke up and she was just standing there in the corner. She didn't move. She just watched me." Ellie felt a chill run down her spine. "What did she look like?" Sam hesitated. "I couldn't see her face. She was blurry, like smoke, but I could feel her looking at me. She whispered something, but I couldn't understand the words." He swallowed hard, clutching the wooden horse tighter. "I think she wants me to stay here." Ellie's stomach twisted. "Stay here? What are you talking about?" Sam didn't answer. He just stared at the wooden horse, his expression distant. Ellie reached across the table, grabbing his hand. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "We're going to figure this out, okay? We'll find out what's happening, and we'll stop it." But even as she said the words, she wasn't sure she believed them. Ellie spent the rest of the day searching the house for the key from Eliza's diary. She checked every drawer, every cabinet, even the spaces under the floorboards where the wood had rotted away. But she found nothing. By evening, she was exhausted and frustrated. She slumped down on the couch, staring at the faint patterns in the wallpaper. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and twist as the sunlight faded, and Ellie shivered, pulling her knees to her chest. The key is hidden where the shadows gather. Eliza's words echoed in her mind, taunting her. Where did the shadows gather? Everywhere she looked, the house was full of them. But there was something different about the shadows in the hidden room. They moved on their own, shifting like living things. And when they had reached for her, it was as though they wanted something. Ellie sat up suddenly, her heart racing. What if the shadows weren't just random? What if they were trying to tell her something? She grabbed her flashlight and crept back to the hidden door at the end of the hallway. The staircase seemed steeper than before, the air colder. Ellie descended slowly, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. When she reached the bottom, she hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. Then she pushed the door open. The shadows were waiting for her. They clung to the walls and the ceiling, swirling like smoke. Ellie stepped into the room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The shadows didn't move toward her this time. Instead, they seemed to hover around a single spot in the corner of the room. Ellie hesitated, then followed their gaze, or what she imagined was their gaze. The beam of her flashlight landed on a small crack in the floorboards. Her breath caught in her throat. She knelt down, prying at the boards with her fingers. They came loose more easily than she expected, revealing a small, hollow space underneath. Inside was a key. It was exactly as Eliza had drawn it, jagged and unusual, its surface tarnished with age. Ellie picked it up, her fingers trembling. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, retreating into the corners. For a moment, the air felt lighter, as though the house had released a long-held breath. Ellie didn't wait to see what would happen next. She stuffed the key into her pocket and ran back up the stairs. Ellie waited until everyone else was asleep before she made her way to the wardrobe. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards under her feet. She held the key tightly in her hand, its metal cold against her skin. When she reached the wardrobe, she hesitated. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The shadows in the hallway seemed to crowd closer, gathering around her like an audience. Ellie took a deep breath and inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a loud click. The wardrobe door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty space inside. At first, Ellie thought there was nothing there, but then she saw it, a faint shimmer in the back of the wardrobe, like a ripple in the air. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface. It felt cold, like ice, and her hand passed through it as though it wasn't there. Ellie froze, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled her hand back, staring at the shimmering surface. It wasn't just a wardrobe, it was a doorway. But a doorway to where? The whispers began again, louder this time, filling her ears with a cacophony of voices. She stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering. The shadows in the hallway surged forward, wrapping around her like a cloak. Ellie tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then she was falling. When Ellie opened her eyes, she was no longer in the hallway. She was standing in a vast, empty space. The ground beneath her feet smooth and cold like polished stone. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The shadows were everywhere. They swirled around her, their forms shifting and twisting. In the distance, Ellie saw a figure standing perfectly still. It was a woman, her body shrouded in darkness, her face hidden beneath a veil of shadows. Ellie took a step forward, her legs trembling. "Who are you?" she called out. The woman didn't answer. She raised a hand, pointing toward Ellie. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around her like chains. Ellie struggled, but they held her tight, pulling her toward the figure in the distance. "You shouldn't have come here," the woman said, her voice echoing like 1,000 whispers. "The house does not forgive." Ellie opened her mouth to scream, but the shadows closed over her, dragging her down into the darkness. Ellie awoke in darkness. At first, she wasn't sure if she was even awake. She couldn't see anything, not the faint shimmer of the wardrobe doorway, not the shadowed woman, not her own hands in front of her face. The air was thick, pressing against her skin like a damp blanket. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one echoing faintly in the void around her. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, her limbs sluggish. It was as though the darkness itself was pushing against her, holding her in place. And then she heard it, the whispering. It was everywhere, all around her, a cacophony of voices that grew louder and louder until she thought her head might split open. "Stop!" she screamed, clapping her hands over her ears. But the voices didn't stop. They pressed against her mind, filling her thoughts with images she didn't understand. Flashes of fire and blood, a woman standing in a field of ash, a dark figure reaching out with hands as black as coal. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut, willing it all to stop. "Please," she whispered. "Please, just let me go." And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispering stopped. Ellie opened her eyes, blinking against the sudden light. She was no longer in the void. She was standing in a long, narrow hallway, its walls lined with mirrors. The air was cold, and her breath puffed out in small clouds. The mirrors reflected her pale, frightened face back at her. But as she turned her head, she realized something was wrong. Her reflection wasn't moving. Ellie froze, her heart racing. She lifted her hand, waving it in front of her face, but the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it stood perfectly still, staring at her with hollow, empty eyes. And then it smiled. Ellie stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Its eyes gleamed with a faint, otherworldly light, and its smile stretched wider, too wide, as though the skin of its face were tearing. What are you?" Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection tilted its head, mimicking her movements. "You," it said, its voice low and distorted, like the sound of wind rushing through a hollow tunnel. "I am you." "That's not possible," Ellie said, her back pressing against the cold, mirrored wall behind her. "You're not me." The reflection's smile faded, its face twisted, the features warping and stretching like melting wax. "No," it said, its voice louder now, deeper. "I am what the house made you." Ellie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "This isn't real. This can't be real. I just want to go home." The reflection stepped closer, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. "There is no home. There is only the house, and the house does not let go." Ellie tried to run, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor, but the hallway stretched on endlessly. No matter how far she ran, the reflection was always right behind her, its footsteps silent, its hollow eyes unblinking. "Ellie," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "Ellie, stop running. You can't escape. You belong to the house now." Ellie didn't know how long she ran. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the endless hallway, the mirrors on either side reflecting her terrified face back at her again and again. But eventually, she couldn't run anymore. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the cold floor, gasping for air. The reflection stood over her, its face blank and expressionless. "You cannot run from the truth," it said. "The house has claimed you, just as it claimed her." Ellie looked up at it, her body trembling. Who? Who did it claim?" The reflection tilted its head, and for a moment its face flickered, shifting into the visage of the shadowed woman Ellie had seen in the wardrobe. "She came before you," it said. "She opened the door, just as you did, and she paid the price." "Who is she?" Ellie demanded, forcing herself to her feet. "What does she want?" The reflection's face shifted again, becoming her own once more. "She wants what the house took from her, what the house takes from everyone." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. "And what is that?" The reflection smiled. "Her soul." Before Ellie could react, the mirrors around her shattered, a deafening crash that sent shards of glass flying in every direction. She screamed, throwing her arms up to shield her face, but when she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the hallway. She was back in the hidden room beneath the house. The diary was lying on the floor beside her, its pages fluttering in a breeze that seemed to come from nowhere. Ellie picked it up with trembling hands, flipping through the pages. Near the back, she found a passage she hadn't seen before. The handwriting was frantic, the words scrawled in uneven lines. "The house feeds on us. It draws us in, makes us part of it. There is no escape. I can feel it taking me, little by little, piece by piece. If you are reading this, it is too late for me. But perhaps it is not too late for you." Ellie's hands shook as she read the final line. "Find the heart of the house. Destroy it. It is the only way to break the curse." Ellie didn't know what the heart of the house was, but she knew she didn't have much time to find it. The shadows were closing in around her, their forms shifting and writhing like living things. She clutched the diary to her chest and ran up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. When she reached the top, she froze. The house was different now. The walls seemed taller, the hallways longer. The wallpaper pulsed faintly, as though the house itself were alive. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and the whispers were louder than ever. Ellie took a deep breath, forcing herself to move forward. She didn't know where she was going, but something deep inside her, something primal, was guiding her. She followed the whispers, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The whispers led her to the living room. The furniture was gone, the room empty except for a single door in the center of the floor. It was small and square, with no handle, but as Ellie approached, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "The heart of the house." She crouched down, pressing her hands against the edges of the door. It was heavy, but she managed to pry it open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. Ellie hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. But she knew she didn't have a choice. If she wanted to escape, if she wanted to save herself and Sam, she had to go down. Clutching the diary tightly, she descended into the darkness. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. Ellie could feel the house around her, its walls pressing in, its whispers growing louder, more frantic. And then she heard it, a low, steady thumping sound, like the beat of a massive heart. The staircase ended in a cavernous room, its walls lined with pulsing, organic shapes that glistened in the dim light. In the center of the room was a massive black structure, its surface smooth and polished like obsidian. It pulsed faintly, in time with the heartbeat. Ellie stepped closer, her legs trembling. She could feel the power emanating from the structure, the raw, malevolent energy that seemed to seep into her bones. This was it. The heart of the house. The diary had said to destroy it, but how? She didn't have any tools, any weapons. All she had was herself. She stepped closer, placing her hand against the cold, smooth surface. The whispers in her head grew louder, screaming at her to stop, to turn back. But Ellie didn't stop. She pressed both hands against the heart, pushing with all her strength. The surface cracked beneath her palms, and a deep guttural roar filled the room. The shadows surged toward her, their forms twisting and writhing, but Ellie didn't let go. With a final, desperate scream, she drove her fist into the heart of the house, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. The moment the heart shattered, the house began to shake. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and the shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke. Ellie staggered backward, shielding her face as the cavern collapsed around her. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Ellie opened her eyes. She was lying on the floor of the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. The house was quiet, the air still. For the first time since they'd moved in, it felt normal. She sat up, her head spinning. Sam was standing in the doorway, the wooden horse still clutched in his hands. "Ellie?" he said, his voice trembling. Ellie smiled weakly. "It's over," she said. "The house is gone." Sam didn't say anything. He just ran to her, wrapping his arms around her. Ellie held him tightly, her eyes filling with tears. They were safe. They were free. But as they stepped outside, leaving the house behind, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Something that wasn't ready to let go. The Hollow Watcher. It was a cold, moonless night in early November when Claire found herself driving down an unfamiliar stretch of road. The GPS on her phone had stopped working hours ago, leaving her to navigate the back roads of rural Pennsylvania with nothing but her increasingly unreliable instincts. She had been heading to her grandmother's house to help her move into an assisted living facility, but now she was completely lost, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to close in on her the further she drove. The trees outside her car window were skeletal, their bare branches clawing at the sky like grasping hands. The headlights of her car illuminated only short stretches of cracked asphalt, and beyond that, the darkness swallowed everything. There were no streetlights, no signs of civilization, and no other cars for miles. Her gas tank was dangerously low, the needle hovering just above empty. She cursed under her breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Just as she was starting to consider pulling over to call for help, a sign appeared in the distance. It was old, wooden, and half hidden by vines, but she could just make out the words, "Welcome to Hollow Creek. Population 42. Claire frowned. She didn't remember seeing anything about a town called Hollow Creek on the map, but with no other options, she decided to press on. Maybe someone in the town could give her directions or at the very least, let her refuel. She turned onto a narrow dirt road that led into the heart of the town, her tires crunching over fallen leaves. The town that time forgot, Hollow Creek was unlike any place Claire had ever seen. The buildings were old and weathered, their wooden frames sagging like they had been standing for centuries. The streets were eerily quiet, and not a single light shone from the windows of the houses. It was as if the entire town was asleep or abandoned. Claire's unease grew with every passing second. She parked her car in what appeared to be the town square, a small, open space dominated by a decrepit fountain. The statue in the center of the fountain was strange, a tall, faceless figure carved from black stone, its arms outstretched as if to welcome or warn visitors. The water in the fountain was stagnant and reeked of decay. Claire stepped out of her car, shivering as the cold air bit at her skin. She wrapped her coat tightly around herself and looked around, hoping to spot someone, anyone who could help her. But the town was utterly deserted. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. The only sound was the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Just as she was about to give up and get back in her car, she noticed a faint light flickering in the window of a nearby building. It was the first sign of life she had seen since arriving in Hollow Creek. Without hesitation, she made her way toward it. The keeper of the inn. The building turned out to be an old inn, its sign barely legible in the dim light. It read, "The Hollow Watcher's Rest." The door creaked loudly as Claire pushed it open, and she stepped inside to find a small, dimly lit lobby. A single oil lamp burned on the front desk, casting long shadows across the room. Behind the desk stood an elderly man with thin, wispy hair and hollow cheeks. His pale blue eyes seemed almost luminous in the gloom. "Well, well," he said in a raspy voice. "We don't get many visitors round here." Claire forced a smile, though something about the man's gaze unsettled her. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm lost. My car's almost out of gas, and I was wondering if there's a gas station nearby." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "No gas station in Hollow Creek, I'm afraid. Closest one's about 20 miles back the way you came." Claire's stomach sank. 20 miles? I don't think I have enough gas to make it that far." The man tilted his head, studying her intently. "Well, you're welcome to stay the night here. Roads aren't safe after dark." Claire hesitated. The thought of spending the night in this creepy little town was far from appealing. But the alternative, being stranded on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, was even worse. "Okay," she said finally. "How much for a room?" The man smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "For you. No charge. Consider it. Hospitality." The warning. The old man handed Claire a tarnished brass key and directed her to a room on the second floor. The hallway leading to her room was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs casting unsteady shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The air smelled musty, like mildew and something faintly metallic. Her room was small and sparsely furnished. A single bed with a faded quilt, a wooden dresser, and a mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The window overlooked the town square, and from her vantage point she could see the dark statue in the fountain staring up at her. As she unpacked her overnight bag, something caught her attention. Scratched into the wood of the dresser was a single word: leave. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She ran her fingers over the carving, trying to convince herself it was just some prank left by a previous guest. But as she looked closer, she noticed more words, etched into the walls, the bed frame, even the mirror. "Don't stay. It watches. Get out while you can." A chill ran down her spine. She backed away from the dresser, her pulse racing. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room. She turned toward the door, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just another knock, louder this time. Slowly, she approached the door and opened it. The hallway was empty. The watcher in the dark. Claire barely slept that night. She kept hearing strange noises, whispers in the hall, faint tapping on the walls, and once the sound of footsteps pacing outside her door. Each time she worked up the courage to look, there was no one there. Sometime after midnight, she heard a new sound, a low, rhythmic creaking, like the groan of wood under strain. It was coming from outside. She pulled back the curtain and peered out the window. The statue in the fountain was moving. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. But as she watched, the faceless figure began to shift, its head tilting upward as if it were looking directly at her. Its arms, once outstretched, now hung limply at its sides, and its torso twisted unnaturally, like a marionette on tangled strings. Claire stumbled back from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. She grabbed her phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. The screen flickered and went black. A sudden, deafening bang shook the room, and the lights went out. Claire froze, listening as heavy footsteps echoed up the stairs. They were slow and deliberate, each step reverberating through the silent inn. She backed into the corner of the room, clutching a lamp as an improvised weapon. The footsteps stopped just outside her door, and then the knob began to turn. The hollow watcher, Claire didn't wait to see who, or what, was on the other side. She threw open the window and climbed out onto the narrow ledge, the freezing wind cutting through her thin pajamas. Below, the town square was empty, but the statue was now gone. She didn't have time to think. She lowered herself down, dropping into the street below. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed, but she forced herself to keep moving, limping toward her car. The inn's front door creaked open behind her, and she heard the sound of footsteps again. This time faster, more purposeful. She didn't dare look back. When she reached her car, she fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fit them into the lock. Finally, the door opened, and she scrambled inside, slamming it shut behind her. But as she turned the key in the ignition, the headlights illuminated something in the rearview mirror. The statue was sitting in the back seat, its head tilted toward her, and though it had no face, she could feel its gaze boring into her. A single word echoed in her mind, spoken in a voice that was not her own. Stay. The last thing Claire saw was the car's headlights flickering and dying, plunging the world into darkness. Epilogue. The next morning, the residents of Hollow Creek, what few remained, found her car abandoned in the center of town. There was no sign of Claire, but the statue had returned to the fountain. Its arms were outstretched once more, and its face was no longer blank. Poe the Hollow Watcher's marked days turned to weeks, and Claire's disappearance became just another unsolved mystery. Her family filed a missing persons report, but the authorities found no leads. The only clue was her car, eerily parked in the center of Hollow Creek with the keys still in the ignition. The officers who investigated the case described the town as unsettling, though they couldn't explain why. None of them stayed longer than they had to. But Hollow Creek was not done with Claire, or anyone else who crossed its path. The stranger 2 months after Claire vanished, a man named Daniel drove through the same rural backroads. Daniel was a journalist, known for his hard-hitting exposés on small-town corruption and forgotten tragedies. He had read about Claire's disappearance online and sensed a story worth chasing. Something about Hollow Creek had drawn him in, a curiosity he couldn't quite explain. The locals he interviewed in nearby towns were reluctant to talk about Hollow Creek. Some claimed it didn't exist, while others spoke in hushed tones, warning him to stay away. One elderly woman, her hands trembling as she spoke, whispered, "The Watcher doesn't like visitors, especially the curious ones." Daniel dismissed the warnings as superstition. He had chased stories in far more dangerous places than some forgotten little town. Armed with a flashlight, a notebook, and his camera, he set out to find Hollow Creek. He found the town just as Claire had. The wooden sign partially hidden by vines, the dirt road winding into the forest, and the eerie silence that seemed to press down on him as he drove deeper. When he reached the town square, he parked by the fountain and stepped out of his car. The statue was there, its faceless head tilted slightly upward, as if it were watching the sky. Daniel felt a shiver run through him, but chalked it up to the cold. He pulled out his camera and snapped a few photos of the fountain, the statue, and the crumbling buildings around him. The town looked abandoned, but he noticed small signs of life. A curtain fluttering in a window, a faint glow from the inn. He approached the inn, the sign above the door swaying gently in the wind. "The Hollow Watcher's Rest," it read. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and inside, he found the same dimly lit lobby Claire had entered weeks before. The old man was there, standing behind the desk, his pale blue eyes fixed on Daniel, and a slow, unsettling smile spread across his face. "Another visitor," the man said, his voice rasping. "Come to see the Watcher, have you?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm actually here to ask some questions. There was a woman, Claire Harrington, who disappeared a couple of months ago. She was last seen here." The old man's smile faltered for a moment, but then it returned. "Ah, yes, Claire, such a lovely young woman. She stayed here, just like you'll be staying." Daniel frowned. "I'm not planning to stay. I just need some answers." The old man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "No one ever plans to stay, but the Watcher has a way of making arrangements." A town of shadows, Daniel ignored the cryptic remark and pressed on with his questions, but the old man refused to give him any meaningful answers. Frustrated, Daniel left the inn and began exploring the town on foot. The streets were unnervingly quiet, and every so often, he felt the distinct sensation of being watched. He noticed more strange details. Windows covered in thick black curtains, doors with elaborate locks on the outside rather than the inside, and symbols carved into the wooden frames of the buildings. The symbols were crude but unmistakably deliberate, circles with jagged lines radiating outward like a sunburst or an eye. As he wandered, he came across a small, overgrown cemetery on the edge of town. The gravestones were ancient, their inscriptions barely legible, but one stood out. It was newer than the others, the name carved into the stone making Daniel's blood run cold. Claire Harrington, 1993-2024. His breath caught in his throat. It wasn't possible. Claire couldn't be dead. There had been no body, no confirmation of her fate. And yet, here was her grave, nestled among the others in this forgotten town. He took a step back, his heart pounding. That was when he noticed the shadows. They stretched unnaturally long across the ground, moving even though the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. He turned quickly, scanning the cemetery, but there was no one there. And yet he wasn't alone. The whispering woods, a faint whisper reached his ears, carried on the cold wind. It was soft at first, almost like the rustling of leaves, but it grew louder, more insistent. The words were unintelligible, but their tone was pleading, desperate. Daniel stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his hand. He pointed the beam into the woods surrounding the cemetery, the light cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, something tall and thin slipping between the trees. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the silence. When he reached his car, he jumped inside and locked the doors, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. He glanced at the fountain in the square, and his stomach dropped. The statue was gone. The watcher comes. Daniel fumbled with his keys, trying to start the car, but the engine refused to turn over. He pounded the steering wheel in frustration, glancing nervously at the empty pedestal where the statue had stood. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him. He could hear them inside the car, inside his head. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw faces in the windows of the buildings around him. Pale, hollow-eyed faces staring at him with expressions of sorrow and fear. A sharp knock on the driver's side window made him jump. He turned to see the old man from the inn standing there, his face eerily calm. "You can't leave," the old man said, his voice muffled through the glass. "The watcher has chosen you." Daniel shook his head, panic rising in his chest. "Let me go," he shouted. "I don't want any part of this." The old man's expression darkened. "It's not about what you want, it's about what the watcher needs." Before Daniel could respond, the whispers swelled to a deafening roar, and the world around him seemed to warp and twist. The streetlights flickered wildly, and the shadows grew longer, converging on his car. And then he saw it. The watcher. It emerged from the darkness, its faceless head tilting unnaturally as it moved toward him. Its body was impossibly tall and thin, its limbs twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. The whispers grew louder, almost unbearable, as the watcher reached out with one long, spindly arm. Daniel screamed as the shadows swallowed him whole. Another name. The next morning the town was quiet once more. The statue had returned to its pedestal, its faceless head tilted toward the sky. In the cemetery, a new gravestone had appeared. It read, "Daniel Carter, 1987 to 2025. And somewhere, in the heart of Hollow Creek, the watcher waited for its next visitor. Hollow Creek was a town that seemed to exist outside the bounds of time and reason. Its population never grew, its boundaries never expanded. It appeared on no modern maps, and any who stumbled across it did so by accident, or by fate. The Watcher, as the few remaining residents called it, had been there long before the town itself. Some said it was a guardian, others a curse. But everyone agreed on one thing. Once the Watcher marked you, there was no escape. A new arrival. 3 weeks after Daniel's disappearance, a woman named Lila made her way into Hollow Creek. Unlike Claire or Daniel, Lila hadn't stumbled upon the town by accident. She had been looking for it. Lila was Claire's best friend and had spent countless sleepless nights searching for answers about her disappearance. She had traced Claire's last known movements, interviewed anyone who might have seen her, and even spent hours poring over maps of rural Pennsylvania. When she finally learned about Hollow Creek from a cryptic post on an urban legend forum, she knew she had to go. Her boyfriend had pleaded with her to stay home, warning her not to chase ghosts. But Lila couldn't let it go. She owed it to Claire to find the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. When she arrived at the wooden sign marking the entrance to Hollow Creek, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she had dreamed of this place before. The skeletal trees, the dirt road, the oppressive silence, it all felt eerily familiar. She drove into town, her headlights cutting through the darkness, and parked in the same spot by the fountain. The statue was there, just as Daniel had seen it, its faceless head tilted slightly upward. But this time, its arms were different. One was outstretched, pointing toward the inn. The Watcher's Rest Lila approached the inn cautiously, her flashlight sweeping over the cracked wooden steps and peeling paint. The sign above the door swayed in the cold wind, the words, "The Hollow Watcher's Rest," barely visible beneath layers of grime. The lobby was empty when she entered. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly rotten. The oil lamp on the desk cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the room feel alive. "Hello?" Lila called out, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was no response. Then from the shadows, the old man appeared. His pale blue eyes locked onto hers, and she felt an involuntary shiver run down her spine. "Another visitor," he said, his voice dry and rasping. "You shouldn't be here." Lila straightened her shoulders, trying to appear braver than she felt. "I'm looking for my friend, Claire Harrington. She came through here a couple of months ago." The old man's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow darker, colder. "Claire," he repeated softly. "Yes, I remember her. She stayed here." "Where is she?" Lila demanded. "What happened to her?" The old man tilted his head, his gaze never leaving hers. "She belongs to the Watcher now, just as you will." Lila took a step back, her heart pounding. "What are you talking about? What is the Watcher?" The old man smiled faintly, but it was a joyless expression. "The Watcher sees all. It knows all. It hungers." Before Lila could ask more, the oil lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, but when she turned it on, the old man was gone. The whispers began, soft at first, just on the edge of hearing, but growing louder with every passing second. The town's secrets. Determined not to give in to fear, Lila left the inn and began exploring the town. She found the same strange carvings Daniel had noticed, the jagged, sunburst-like symbols etched into door frames, windowsills, and even the cobblestones of the street. She also discovered the cemetery. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw Claire's grave. The sight of her friend's name carved into the cold stone hit her like a physical blow. Tears blurred her vision as she dropped to her knees, tracing the letters with trembling fingers. "I'm going to find you," she whispered. "I promise." As she stood, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow moved between the trees at the edge of the cemetery. She turned, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. And then she heard it, a low, guttural laugh that sent chills down her spine. The Watcher's call. Lila's search led her to the church at the edge of town, a crumbling stone building with a bell tower that leaned precariously to one side. Inside, she found rows of rotting pews and an altar covered in dust. But it was the mural on the far wall that held her attention. The painting depicted the Watcher. Its faceless head loomed over a group of kneeling townsfolk, its long arms outstretched as if in judgment. Around the Watcher were dozens of symbols, the same ones carved into the town's buildings. At the base of the mural, written in faded red paint, were the words, "The Watcher keeps us, the Watcher takes us, the Watcher sees all." Lila backed away, her stomach churning. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the empty church. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut in front of her, the sound reverberating through the building. The shadows in the corners of the church began to move, slithering across the walls like living things. And then, from the darkness, the Watcher emerged. It was just as Daniel had described, impossibly tall and thin, its limbs twisting and bending in ways that defied logic. Its faceless head tilted toward her, and though it had no eyes, she could feel its gaze piercing through her. Lila froze, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The Watcher loomed over her, its presence overwhelming. The whispers filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts, until one voice rose above the rest. "You seek her." The words echoed inside her skull, though the Watcher's featureless face remained still. "Yes." Lila whispered, her voice trembling. "Where is she? What have you done to her?" The Watcher's head tilted to one side, as if considering her question. "She is here, as you will be. All who come belong to me." "No," Lila shouted, her fear giving way to anger. "I won't let you take me. I won't let you keep her." The Watcher stretched out one long spindly arm, its fingers, if they could be called that, curling toward her. "There is a choice." Lila's heart raced. "What choice?" The whispers grew louder, forming words she could barely comprehend. A life for a life, a soul for a soul. Leave, and she stays. Stay, and she goes. Tears streamed down Lila's face as she realized what the Watcher was asking. If she stayed, Claire would be free, but she would be trapped in Hollow Creek forever. Lila's voice broke. I can't. The Watcher leaned closer, its presence suffocating. Choose. Lila thought of Claire, her best friend, the person who had always been there for her. She thought of all the nights she had spent searching, hoping, praying for a way to bring her back. And then she made her decision. Take me, she whispered. The Watcher straightened, its faceless head tilting upward. The whispers stopped, and for a moment the world was completely silent. Then the shadows surged forward, enveloping Lila in darkness. Claire woke up in the middle of a forest, gasping for air. She had no memory of how she had gotten there, but she felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as if a terrible weight had been lifted from her soul. She stumbled out of the woods and onto a familiar road. In the distance, she saw headlights approaching. A car pulled over, and the driver, a middle-aged woman, rolled down the window. Are you okay? The woman asked. Do you need help? Claire nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, she said. Please, just get me out of here. The Hollow Watcher waits back in Hollow Creek. The statue in the fountain had changed once again. Its arms were now crossed over its chest, and its faceless head seemed to bow slightly, as if in satisfaction. And in the cemetery, a new grave appeared beside Claire's. Lila Morgan, 1994 to 2025. The Watcher stood in the shadows, waiting patiently. It always waited. Another visitor would come, sooner or later. They always did. And the Watcher would always be watching. The end, or is it? The Whispering Woods. It was said that the woods on the edge of town were alive, not with animals or birds, but with whispers. People claimed they could hear them at night, faint murmurs carried on the wind. Sometimes it was a single voice, other times it sounded like an entire crowd speaking in unison. No one dared enter after sunset. At least, no one who wanted to come back. Eleanor didn't believe in ghost stories. She had moved to the small, quiet town 6 months ago, desperate for a fresh start after her divorce. She had heard plenty about the woods from her neighbors, how the trees seemed to lean in close, how shadows moved where no one stood. But in Eleanor's mind, they were just stories to keep the town's kids from wandering off too far. That is, until the whispers began to creep into her own nights. At first, she thought it was just the wind. Her new home sat near the tree line, and it wasn't uncommon for the sound of rustling leaves to drift through her windows. But one night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she realized it wasn't the wind at all. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, like someone murmuring just out of earshot, a single, wordless voice. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks on her. But the next night, it wasn't just one voice. There were 2, then 3, and they were getting louder. Eleanor tried playing music to drown them out, but it didn't help. The whispers seemed to slip through the walls, through her headphones, through the very air around her. She closed her windows and locked her doors, but it made no difference. The voices were inside. One evening, desperate for answers, she brought it up to her neighbor, Mrs. Carver, an elderly woman who had lived in the town her whole life. Mrs. Carver's face went pale at the mention of the whispers. You've heard them, she whispered, clutching Eleanor's hand. Oh, child, you mustn't listen. That's how they get in. Get in? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling despite herself. Mrs. Carver nodded gravely. The woods don't just whisper. They call. They want you to follow. And if you do, you'll never leave. Eleanor laughed nervously. That's ridiculous. It's just the wind or something. Mrs. Carver's grip tightened. Do not mock them. Whatever you do, don't go into those woods. Not at night. But Eleanor wasn't afraid. Not yet. That night, she lay in bed and tried to sleep. The whispers came again, louder than ever, like a crowd had gathered just outside her window. She turned on her bedside lamp, hoping the light would chase them away, but it didn't. The voices grew clearer, almost forming words. Come, come. Eleanor sat up, her heart pounding. This wasn't her imagination. She could hear them, as real as someone whispering in her ear. She covered her head with her pillow, but the voices didn't stop. And then something worse happened. There was a knock at her window. She froze. Her bedroom was on the 2nd floor. The knock came again, louder this time, and then the whispers joined it, insistent and eager. Come, come. Eleanor's breathing quickened. She didn't want to look, but her body moved on its own, her head turning slowly toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but she could see a faint outline, a shadow standing just outside. It was too tall to be a person, too thin. Its fingers, if they were fingers, dragged slowly across the glass, making a sound like nails on a chalkboard. She wanted to scream but didn't dare. She sat frozen, clutching her blanket, her mind racing. And then the whispers shifted, no longer coming from outside the window. They were behind her. She turned her head slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. The shadows in her room seemed to stretch and twist, pulling into a shape that shouldn't have been there. Eyes, dark, empty eyes, stared back at her from the corner of her room. A crooked smile spread across its face, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. The whispers grew louder, deafening, as the shadow began to move toward her. The next morning, Eleanor's house was quiet. When her neighbor came by to check on her, the door was ajar, the bed neatly made, but Eleanor was gone. The townsfolk whispered that she had been claimed by the woods, that she had listened too closely to the voices and followed them into the trees. And if you stand outside her empty home on a quiet night, you can still hear the whispers. They say the woods are alive, and now Eleanor is part of them. Eleanor wasn't the first to disappear. The town had a long history of whispers, warnings, and vanishings that stretched back over a century. But unlike the others, Eleanor's disappearance was different. The whispers in the woods didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder, as if something had been added to their haunting chorus. Mrs. Carver, the town's oldest resident, noticed the change immediately. She had been expecting Eleanor's fate ever since the younger woman mentioned hearing the whispers. Yet, as she sat in her rocking chair by the window that morning, something gnawed at her. The whispers carried a new edge, something sharper, more insistent. And though she had spent her life avoiding the woods, for the first time in decades, she felt compelled to listen. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, Mrs. Carver gathered her courage and visited the town's library. She wasn't alone. Others had noticed the change too. A small group of townsfolk whispered among themselves in the dimly lit building, their faces pale and drawn. "Another one's gone," said Mr. Hensley, the town's baker, his voice tight. "Eleanor, just like the others." "We should have warned her better," muttered Greta, the clerk from the general store. "We did warn her," snapped Mrs. Carver, "but she didn't listen. None of them ever do." "Something's different this time," said a younger man, his voice trembling. He was new to the town, like Eleanor had been. "The whispers, they're getting louder. They're everywhere now, even in my house." Mrs. Carver nodded grimly. "The woods have taken her, and they're not done. Mark my words, this isn't over." Eleanor's awakening. Eleanor woke to the sound of silence. She opened her eyes slowly, her head pounding, her body heavy. She wasn't in her bed. She wasn't even in her house. The air was damp and cold, and the faint scent of moss and decay filled her nose. She sat up, her hands sinking into soft, spongy earth, the woods. The realization hit her like a slap. She was in the woods. But how? The last thing she remembered was the whispers, the shadow in her room, the thing at her window. Her breath quickened as the memory flooded back. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes darting around. The trees loomed high above her, their twisted branches blocking out the moonlight. Shadows stretched in every direction, and the air felt thick, oppressive. She wasn't alone. The whispers were there, faint but unmistakable, weaving through the trees like a living thing. Eleanor spun around, trying to pinpoint their source, but they seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. Is someone there?" The whispers stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a single voice emerged, soft and childlike, from somewhere behind her. "Eleanor," she froze. The voice was familiar, but she couldn't place it. Slowly she turned, her heart hammering in her chest. A child stood a few feet away, barely visible in the dim light. She couldn't have been older than 10, her face pale and expressionless, her hair tangled and matted with leaves. She wore a simple white dress, torn and smudged with dirt. "Eleanor," the girl said again, her voice flat. "You came." "I didn't mean to," Eleanor stammered, taking a step back. "I don't know how I got here." The girl tilted her head, her dark eyes unblinking. "They brought you. Like they brought me. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Who? Who brought me? The girl didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began to walk deeper into the woods, her bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. Wait, Eleanor called. Where are you going? The girl didn't stop. She didn't look back, and though every instinct screamed at Eleanor to run the other way, she found herself following. The whispers returned, growing louder with each step. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Where are we going? Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. She led Eleanor to a small clearing, where a massive ancient tree stood at its center. Its trunk was blackened and twisted, its roots clawing at the earth like the fingers of some buried giant. The air around it was thick and heavy, and Eleanor felt a wave of nausea as she approached. The girl stopped at the edge of the clearing and turned to face Eleanor. Her expression was blank, but her eyes seemed to glisten with something dark, something alive. This is where they come, the girl said softly. Where who comes? Eleanor whispered. The ones who listen. The history of the woods. Back in the library, Mrs. Carver pulled an old leather-bound book from the shelf. It was dusty and worn, its spine cracked, its pages yellowed with age. The title, barely legible, read The Whispering Curse. She placed it on the table, and the small group gathered around her. This book was written by my grandfather, she explained. He was one of the first settlers here. He wrote about the woods, about the whispers. He said they weren't natural, that they were something else. Something else, Mr. Hensley echoed nervously. Mrs. Carver nodded. He believed the woods were cursed, that something ancient lives beneath them, something that feeds on the living. It calls to people, draws them in, and once they're taken, they become part of it. Part of it? Greta asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Carver opened the book to a page filled with crude, hand-drawn illustrations. One showed a figure standing before the ancient tree. Another depicted shadowy tendrils wrapping around a person, pulling them into the ground. They don't just die, Mrs. Carver said. Their souls are consumed. They become the whispers. Eleanor's descent. Eleanor stared at the ancient tree, her stomach churning. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very roots of the earth. What is this place? She asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. The heart of the woods, the girl replied. This is where it began, and this is where it ends. Eleanor took a step back. I don't understand. Why am I here? What do you want from me? The girl's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to darken. It's not what I want, it's what they want. The ground beneath Eleanor's feet began to tremble. The tree's roots shifted, writhing like snakes. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the clearing, and Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Run, the girl said suddenly, her voice urgent. What? Eleanor stammered. Run, the girl screamed. Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She turned and bolted back into the woods, the whispers chasing her like a swarm of angry bees. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, the trees closing in, their branches clawing at her as she ran. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if she could escape. All she knew was that she couldn't stop. The voices were in her head now, screaming her name, urging her to turn back, to give in. But she didn't. She kept running, her lungs burning, her legs aching. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the whispers stopped. Eleanor stumbled to a halt, gasping for air. The woods were silent. The trees were still. She looked around, her heart pounding, but there was no sign of the girl, no sign of the tree. Had she escaped? A faint sound reached her ears, a child's laughter. She turned slowly, her blood running cold. The girl stood behind her, her eyes black as coal, her mouth twisted into a chilling smile. You can't run, she said. You're already theirs. To be continued. Eleanor's escape, the girl's words echoed in Eleanor's mind. You're already theirs. Eleanor stumbled back, her breath ragged and shallow. The child's eyes, those black, empty voids, seemed to pull at her, filling her with a bone-deep terror. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place. The whispers returned. They were louder now, more insistent, wrapping around her like invisible chains. Stay. Don't fight. You belong to us. Eleanor clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block them out, but the voices were inside her head, a relentless tide she couldn't escape. No, she screamed. I don't belong to you. I'm leaving. The girl tilted her head, her smile widening unnaturally. Her voice, when she spoke, was not her own. It was deeper, ancient, layered with countless other voices. You cannot leave. You are part of the woods now. Eleanor's heart hammered as the girl began to step toward her, her small, pale feet making no sound on the mossy ground. Shadows seemed to ripple around her, stretching and twisting like living things. Eleanor turned and ran. The forest was a labyrinth of darkness, the gnarled trees stretching toward her like claws. The roots seemed to rise up to catch her feet, the branches scraping her arms and face as she pushed through. The whispers followed her, growing louder, angrier. Stop running. You can't escape. Come back to us. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Her only focus was on moving forward, on putting as much distance as possible between herself and that thing. But the forest didn't want her to leave. The ground shifted beneath her feet, the soft earth sinking like quicksand. She stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. The moss beneath her palms was slick and cold, and when she tried to push herself up, her fingers sank into the soil as though it were alive. No, 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 she whispered, her voice trembling. She yanked her hands free and scrambled to her feet, but the forest was closing in around her. The trees seemed closer, their trunks twisting, their branches knitting together into an impenetrable wall. She was trapped. The stranger. Just as despair began to take hold, Eleanor saw it, a flicker of light in the distance. It was faint, barely visible through the thick tangle of trees, but it was there. A glimmer of hope. She ran toward it, her legs burning, her lungs screaming for air. The whispers grew louder, angrier, but she forced herself to keep moving. The light grew brighter, and as she drew closer, she realized it was a lantern, swinging gently in the hand of a figure cloaked in shadow. The figure stood at the edge of a narrow path, their face obscured by the hood of a long, tattered coat. "Help me!" Eleanor cried, stumbling toward them. "Please, I need to get out of here." The figure didn't move. They stood perfectly still, the lantern casting flickering shadows across their face. "Do you hear them?" the figure asked, their voice low and gravelly. Eleanor froze. "What?" "The whispers," the figure said. "Do you hear them?" Eleanor hesitated, her chest heaving. "Yes," she whispered. "They're everywhere. They won't stop. Please, I just want to go home." The figure tilted their head slightly, as if studying her. "It's too late for that," they said. "The woods have claimed you." "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "I don't belong to them. I can still get out. You can help me." The figure laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "No one escapes the Whispering Woods, not once they've been marked." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. The figure raised the lantern, its golden light illuminating the space between them. "Look," they said. Eleanor glanced down at her hands and screamed. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and dark veins snaked up her arms like cracks in glass. The tips of her fingers were blackened, and as she stared in horror, she saw the darkness spreading, creeping up her wrists like ink spilled in water. "What's happening to me?" she cried, stumbling back. "You're becoming one of them," the figure said. "The woods are taking you." "No," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be a way out. There has to be." The figure was silent for a long moment. Then they said, "There is one way, but it's dangerous." "I'll do anything," Eleanor said desperately. "Anything." The figure stepped closer, their lantern casting eerie shadows on their gaunt face. "The heart of the woods," they said. "The tree. Destroy it, and you might break the curse." Eleanor's stomach turned at the memory of the ancient, twisted tree. "But how? I don't have anything. I don't even know where it is." The figure reached into their coat and pulled out a small, rusted knife. They held it out to her. "Take this. You'll know what to do when the time comes." Eleanor hesitated, then took the knife. Its blade was dull and pitted with rust, but it felt heavy in her hand, solid. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure nodded. "Go, before it's too late." The heart of the woods, Eleanor ran. The knife was clutched tightly in her hand, its weight a small comfort against the overwhelming dread that threatened to consume her. The whispers were louder than ever, a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to press in from all sides. The forest twisted around her, the path shifting and changing, but somehow she knew where to go. It was as if something was guiding her, pulling her toward the heart of the woods. And then she saw it. The ancient tree loomed ahead, its blackened trunk twisting skyward, its massive roots clawing at the earth. The air was thick and heavy, and Eleanor felt a wave of nausea as she approached. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the ground trembled beneath her feet. Shadows writhed around the tree, their shapes shifting and flickering like flames. Eleanor gripped the knife tightly, her hands shaking. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, though her voice wavered. "You can't have me." The shadows laughed, their voices cold and hollow. "You are already ours," they hissed. Eleanor stepped forward, her heart pounding. She raised the knife, aiming for the twisted bark of the tree's trunk. But before she could strike, the ground erupted. Dark roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around her legs and arms, pulling her toward the tree. She screamed, struggling against their grip, but they were too strong. The shadows closed in, their laughter echoing in her ears. "You cannot fight us," they said. "You belong to the woods." "No!" Eleanor screamed. Summoning every ounce of strength, she plunged the knife into one of the roots holding her arm. The root recoiled, releasing her, and Eleanor seized the moment. She slashed at the other roots, freeing herself, then turned her attention to the tree. With a cry of defiance, she drove the knife into the trunk. The effect was immediate. The whispers turned to screams, and the shadows writhed violently, their shapes dissolving into smoke. The tree shuddered, its branches twisting and cracking, and a deep, guttural roar filled the air. Eleanor didn't stop. She stabbed the tree again and again, her hands slick with sap that oozed like blood. The ground shook violently and the roots writhed, but she kept going, her desperation fueling her strength. Finally, with one last strike, the tree let out a deafening crack. Its trunk split open, and a blinding light erupted from within, consuming everything. The aftermath. When Eleanor opened her eyes, she was lying on the forest floor. The whispers were gone. The air was still. She sat up slowly, her body aching, and looked around. The woods were different now. The trees were no longer twisted and gnarled, and the oppressive darkness had lifted. She was free. But as she stood and began to make her way back to town, a faint sound reached her ears. A whisper. "We'll come back for you." Eleanor quickened her pace, clutching the rusted knife tightly. She wasn't sure if she had truly escaped, or if the woods were simply waiting for her to return. The lingering shadows, Eleanor didn't remember how she got home. One moment she was stumbling out of the woods, her legs weak and trembling, her hands still clutching the rusted knife. The next, she was standing on her porch, staring at the warped boards of her front door. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her, though she wasn't sure what she was locking out. The house was silent, bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. Everything was as she had left it. The unwashed dishes in the sink, the blanket draped over the back of the couch, the faint smell of coffee grounds lingering in the kitchen. It was all so normal, too normal. Eleanor dropped the knife onto the kitchen counter, its blade still smeared with the sticky black sap from the tree. She stared at it for a long moment, her chest tight with the memory of the woods. The whispers, the shadows, the tree. She shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. It was over. She was home. She was safe. But deep down, she didn't believe it. The first night, Eleanor didn't sleep that night. She tried. She crawled into bed, pulled the covers up to her chin, and closed her eyes. But every time she started to drift off, she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, she thought it was her imagination. The wind, maybe. Or the creak of the house settling. But as the hours passed, the sound grew louder, more distinct. Eleanor, her eyes snapped open, her heart racing. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside her window. She held her breath, straining to hear. Silence. She let out a shaky sigh, rubbing her hands over her face. She was imagining things, she told herself. It was just the trauma of what she'd been through. The woods had gotten inside her head, but it wasn't real. But then she heard it again. "We'll come back for you." Eleanor bolted upright, her hands clutching the blanket. She scanned the room, her eyes wide and frantic, but there was nothing there. Nothing, except the shadow in the corner. It was faint, barely noticeable in the dim light, but it was there. A shape darker than the surrounding darkness, tall and motionless. "Who's there?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't move. It didn't respond. But Eleanor could feel it watching her. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Eleanor stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection. She looked pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken, dark circles ringing them like bruises. Her hands shook as she brushed her hair back from her face. That's when she saw it. The veins. They were faint at first, barely visible beneath the surface of her skin. But as she leaned closer to the mirror, she saw them clearly. Dark, branching lines snaked up her neck and across her collarbone, just like the ones she'd seen in the woods. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, no, no." She scrubbed at her skin with trembling hands, as if she could wash the dark lines away, but they didn't budge. If anything, they seemed to grow darker, spreading further the more she touched them. Panic clawed at her chest. She backed away from the mirror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The woods weren't done with her. The town's whisper. Eleanor wasn't the only one who noticed the change. The townsfolk watched her with wary eyes as she walked through the market, their whispers following her like a shadow. "That's her," she heard someone say. "The one who went into the woods." "I heard she came back," another voice murmured. "No one ever comes back." "She doesn't look right," someone else whispered. "Like she brought something back with her." Eleanor kept her head down, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her coat. She tried to ignore them, but their words cut deep. She had brought something back. She could feel it, a weight pressing on her chest, a shadow clinging to her soul. As she passed the general store, Greta, the clerk, stepped out and grabbed her arm. "Eleanor," she said, her voice low and urgent, "you need to leave." Eleanor blinked, taken aback. "What? You shouldn't have come back," Greta whispered. "The woods don't let people go. Not really. You need to get as far away from here as you can." Eleanor pulled her arm free, her stomach twisting. "I don't know what you're talking about," but she did. As she walked away, she felt their eyes on her, watching, waiting, the shadows within, the whispers didn't stop. They followed Eleanor everywhere, soft, insistent, always just on the edge of hearing. At first she thought they were coming from outside, from the woods. But as the days passed, she realized the truth. The whispers weren't outside. They were inside her. She heard them when she closed her eyes, when she tried to sleep, when she stood in the silence of her kitchen. They murmured to her in 1,000 voices, some familiar, others strange. "Eleanor, you belong to us. Come back to the woods." She started seeing things too, flickers of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that didn't belong. She would turn, expecting to find someone standing behind her, but there was never anyone there, except for the shadow in the corner of her bedroom. It was always there, just out of reach, watching her with unseen eyes. The pull of the woods. One night, Eleanor woke to find herself standing at the edge of the forest. She didn't remember getting out of bed. She didn't remember leaving the house. But there she was, her bare feet sinking into the soft earth, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The whispers were louder here, a constant hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. "Come back. You can't escape. You belong to us." Eleanor took a shaky step back, her heart racing. "No," she whispered. "I won't go back. You can't have me." The woods didn't respond. But as she turned to leave, she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a figure standing among the trees. It was the girl. She was watching Eleanor, her black eyes glinting in the moonlight, her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. Eleanor turned and ran, the whispers chasing her all the way home. The final straw. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay. The woods wouldn't let her go, and the town couldn't help her. The dark veins on her arms were spreading, creeping up toward her shoulders, her chest. The whispers were getting louder, harder to ignore. She didn't know how much longer she could fight, but she wasn't ready to give up, not yet. She packed a bag, grabbed the rusted knife, and climbed into her car. As she drove away from the town, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The woods loomed behind her, dark and silent. But as she turned her eyes back to the road, she heard it again. A whisper. "You can't run forever." Eleanor tightened her grip on the wheel, her jaw set. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let the woods take her. Not without a fight. The road away, Eleanor drove for hours. The narrow, winding road leading away from town stretched endlessly before her, flanked on both sides by fields and forests. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror. half expecting to see the woods creeping closer, their dark branches stretching toward her like claws. But the woods didn't follow. Not physically, at least. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, threading through her thoughts like a splinter lodged in her mind. She turned the radio up, blasting static-filled music to drown them out, but it didn't help. Turn back. You can't run. We are part of you now. Her hands clenched the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Shut up, she muttered through gritted teeth. The whispers didn't. By the time she reached the next town, the sun was rising, casting a pale, golden light over the empty streets. Eleanor pulled into the parking lot of a small motel, her body heavy with exhaustion. She stumbled out of the car, her legs trembling, and checked into a room. The clerk barely looked at her as he handed over the key, but Eleanor caught the way his eyes lingered on the dark veins snaking up her arms. She shut the door to her room, locked it, and collapsed onto the bed. The whispers followed her into her dreams. The search for answers. When Eleanor woke, the sun was high in the sky, its light streaming through the thin curtains. Her head throbbed, her body aching as if she'd run a marathon. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples, and caught sight of her reflection in the cracked mirror across the room. The veins were worse. They spread across her chest now, dark and branching, like the roots of some invasive plant. She pulled her shirt higher, exposing her collarbone, and saw that the veins were creeping toward her throat. Her stomach twisted. She needed answers. Eleanor spent the rest of the day scouring the internet, searching for anything that could explain what was happening to her. Stories of strange disappearances, cursed forests, and malevolent spirits blurred together on her laptop screen, but none of them felt quite right. It wasn't until she stumbled across a forum for paranormal researchers that she found something that made her pause. A post titled "The Curse of the Whispering Woods" caught her attention. Her heart raced as she clicked on it, her eyes scanning the text. The post was written by someone claiming to be a folklorist, someone who had spent years researching the woods near Eleanor's town. According to the post, the Whispering Woods were a nexus of dark energy, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead were dangerously thin. The ancient tree at the heart of the woods was said to be a vessel, a conduit for whatever malevolent force lurked beneath the earth. The author claimed that those who entered the woods and survived often experienced lingering effects, hearing voices, seeing shadows, and in some cases, developing strange physical symptoms. Eleanor's stomach churned as she read the final line of the post. The only way to break the connection is to sever the root. The veins spread. By the third night in the motel, Eleanor could barely look at herself in the mirror. The veins had spread to her face now, thin black lines tracing her jaw and temple. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, and her reflection in the mirror seemed wrong. It wasn't just the veins, it was her eyes. They were darker than they used to be, the whites tinged with gray, and sometimes when she blinked, she thought she saw something moving in them, tiny, flickering shadows that danced just out of sight. The whispers were louder too. They no longer waited for the quiet moments. They spoke over the noise of the television, over the hum of the air conditioner, even over the sound of her own voice. She couldn't tell where they ended, and her own thoughts began. You can't stop it. You will come back. We are inside you. Eleanor slammed her fist against the bathroom counter, her breathing ragged. Get out of my head, she screamed. The whispers laughed. The stranger in the diner. The next morning, Eleanor found herself in a small diner on the outskirts of town. She sat in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee she couldn't bring herself to drink. The smell of frying bacon and stale cigarettes filled the air, but she barely noticed. She was staring out the window, her mind racing, when she heard someone slide into the seat across from her. She looked up sharply, her hand instinctively going to the knife hidden in her bag. The man sitting across from her was older, his face lined and weathered, his gray hair tucked under a battered baseball cap. His eyes were sharp, though, piercing, like he could see straight through her. You've been marked, he said, his voice low. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Who are you? She demanded. The man didn't answer. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I've seen it before, he said. The veins, the whispers, the shadows. Eleanor's hand tightened around her bag. What do you know about it? The man's expression darkened. Enough to know you don't have much time. Eleanor's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The woods don't let go easy, he said. They're inside you now, and if you don't stop it, they'll take you back, one way or another. Eleanor's breath hitched. How do I stop it? The man was silent for a long moment. Then he said, You have to burn it. The tree, the heart of the woods. Eleanor shook her head. I already destroyed it. I stabbed it. That's not enough, the man interrupted. The tree is just the surface. You have to destroy what's beneath it, the root. Eleanor frowned. What root? The man's eyes narrowed. The thing that's feeding it. The thing that's feeding on you. The return to the woods. Eleanor didn't want to go back. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stay away from the woods, to run as far and as fast as she could, but she couldn't ignore the truth, the whispers, the veins, the shadows. They would never stop. Not unless she destroyed whatever was still tethering her to the woods. As she stood at the edge of the forest that night, clutching the rusted knife in one hand and a can of gasoline in the other, she felt the weight of the woods pressing down on her. The air was thick and heavy, and the whispers were louder than ever, ringing in her ears like a swarm of bees. Eleanor, come home. We've been waiting for you. She took a deep breath and stepped into the trees. The forest swallowed her whole. To be continued. The Watcher at the Window. In the small, sleepy town of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, there was a house with a dark reputation. It wasn't abandoned or decrepit. In fact, it looked ordinary at first glance. But the locals knew better. They called it the Watcher's House. For decades, stories had circulated about strange occurrences there. Shadows in the windows when no one was home, lights flickering on and off without explanation, and a feeling of being watched that visitors couldn't shake. The house's most infamous story, though, was tied to a woman named Margaret. In the late 1960s, Margaret and her husband, Tom, moved into the house, unaware of its reputation. Margaret, a practical woman who didn't believe in ghosts or curses, brushed off the warnings from the neighbors. She laughed when they told her about the Watcher, a shadowy figure that was said to appear at the windows at night, staring out at the street. It's just an old house, she'd say. Old houses creak, old houses settle. There's no such thing as ghosts. But Margaret's skepticism didn't last long. It started on their first night in the house. As Margaret was unpacking boxes in the living room, she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, expecting to see Tom, but the room was empty. She shrugged it off, blaming her tired mind. Moving was exhausting, after all. Later that night, as she lay in bed, she heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. She nudged Tom awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Tom groggily listened for a moment, then shook his head. "It's just the house settling," he mumbled, rolling over and falling back asleep. But Margaret wasn't convinced. The footsteps didn't sound like the creaks of an old house. They sounded like someone walking, pacing back and forth just outside their bedroom door. She stayed awake for hours, staring at the door, but it never opened. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The next morning, Margaret tried to shake off her unease. She told herself she was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every time she passed by a window, she felt like someone was standing just outside, staring in. She'd whip her head around, expecting to see a face, but there was never anyone there. A week later, things escalated. Margaret was cooking dinner in the kitchen when she heard a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was coming from the faucet, but then she realized it was coming from the window. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and saw the silhouette of a figure standing just outside. It was tall, with broad shoulders and no discernible features, just a dark shape against the glass. "Tom!" she screamed, dropping the knife she was holding. Tom came running, but by the time he reached the kitchen, the figure was gone. He went outside to check, but there were no footprints in the yard, no sign that anyone had been there. Margaret tried to explain what she'd seen, but Tom didn't believe her. He chalked it up to stress and told her to get some rest. That night, Margaret woke up to the sound of the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't in the hallway. They were in the bedroom. Her blood ran cold as she realized she could feel the weight of someone sitting on the edge of the bed. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe. Slowly, she turned her head to look. And there, sitting at the foot of the bed, was the shadowy figure she had seen in the window. It had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just darkness where a face should have been. But Margaret knew it was watching her. She could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure leaned closer and closer until its featureless face was inches from hers. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Margaret and Tom moved out of the house a week later. They didn't tell anyone why, but Margaret told a close friend years later. She swore the figure followed her, even after they left. She'd see it standing in the shadows at the edge of her yard or reflected in the windows at night. It never came inside again, but she always felt its presence, watching her, waiting. The Watcher's house still stands in Point Pleasant. It's been sold and resold countless times over the years, and every family that moves in leaves within a few months. They all report the same thing: footsteps in the night, shadows in the windows, and the feeling that they're never truly alone. Some say the Watcher is still there, waiting for its next victim. Others think it's tied to the land itself, a remnant of something dark and ancient. Whatever it is, one thing is certain. If you ever find yourself walking past the house, don't look into the windows. You might see something looking back. One of the most popular theories is that the Watcher is tied to the land itself, rather than the house. Point Pleasant has a long history of mysterious and paranormal events, most famously the sightings of the Mothman in the 1960s. Some believe the area is cursed or holds some spiritual significance, possibly due to violence in its past. Point Pleasant was the site of brutal conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples in the 18th century. Local legends speak of a curse placed by Chief Cornstalk, a Shawnee leader who was betrayed and murdered by settlers in 1777. Some believe the Watcher could be a manifestation of this curse, an entity lingering to guard or haunt the area, bound to the land where it happened. A more skeptical, yet still supernatural explanation is that the Watcher could be a residual haunting. Residual hauntings occur when traumatic or emotionally charged events imprint themselves on a location, like a recording that replays over and over. In this case, the Watcher could be the lingering echo of someone who lived or died in the house or on the property. This theory could explain why the Watcher doesn't seem to interact directly with people beyond staring or pacing. It's not conscious, according to this theory, but rather a replay of energy that's tied to the location. For those who believe in more sinister forces, the Watcher is often theorized to be a malevolent spirit or demon. Its behavior, watching, lurking, and its oppressive presence fits common descriptions of entities that feed on fear. In some cases, these spirits are thought to attach themselves to specific people or places, often after being invited in through a careless act, such as tampering with an Ouija board or disturbing something sacred. The fact that Margaret felt its presence even after moving out supports this theory. If the Watcher followed her, it could have formed an attachment to her specifically, possibly because she acknowledged it or because of her fear. The Watcher's description, dark, featureless, and often seen at night, fits with reports of shadow people. Shadow people are a type of paranormal entity often described as dark, humanoid silhouettes that appear in the periphery of vision or during sleep paralysis. They're most commonly associated with feelings of dread and being watched. Some theories suggest shadow people are interdimensional beings, glimpses of parallel realities, or even astral projections of living people. Others believe they're purely psychological phenomena caused by sleep disorders or heightened states of fear. If the Watcher is a shadow person, it could be a transient entity that isn't tied to the house, but simply passing through or drawn to the living for unknown reasons. On a more grounded level, some theorists speculate that the Watcher could have been a human stalker rather than something supernatural. Stories of shadowy figures at windows and footsteps in the house could potentially be explained by someone physically trespassing on the property. This theory is chilling because it's rooted in reality. A stalker could have been hiding on the property, watching the residents, and intentionally scaring them. However, the lack of physical evidence, no footprints, no signs of forced entry, makes this explanation less likely. As with many paranormal cases, it's possible the Watcher is simply an urban legend that grew over time, fueled by the eerie atmosphere of the house and the town's history of strange occurrences. A single unexplained incident, like a shadow seen at the window, could have sparked rumors that snowballed over the years. Margaret's experience might have been genuine, but it's also possible her fear and the house's reputation amplified her perception of events. The human brain is highly suggestible, especially in environments with a history of fear or unease. Point Pleasant is famously associated with the Mothman, a cryptid or supernatural entity that was reportedly seen by dozens of witnesses in the 1960s before the collapse of the Silver Bridge in 1967. Some paranormal enthusiasts theorize that the Mothman sightings and events like the Watcher could be connected, possibly as part of a larger wave of supernatural activity in the area. The Watcher could be another manifestation of the same energy that brought the Mothman to Point Pleasant, whether that energy is spiritual, alien, or something else entirely. The true origins of the Watcher remain a mystery. Whether it's a spirit tied to the land, an echo of the past, a malevolent entity, or even a figment of human imagination, its presence continues to unsettle those who encounter it. The ambiguity is part of what makes the story so chilling. No one knows for sure what the Watcher is, and that uncertainty leaves the door open for fear to take root. If you're ever in Point Pleasant and you pass the Watcher's house, you might want to quicken your step. Whether it's real or not, some places feel like they're better left alone. While stories about the Watcher in Point Pleasant or similar entities in folklore are often based on local legends, they typically center on eerie observations, being watched, hearing footsteps, or seeing shadowy figures, rather than direct interaction. However, there are some documented accounts in folklore, urban legends, and paranormal anecdotes where entities like the Watcher reportedly interacted with people. These could range from subtle, unexplained phenomena to outright terrifying encounters. Below are a few examples of such stories, either tied to the Watcher legend or similar phenomena. Margaret's story, as described earlier, is one of the most well-known cases tied to the Watcher's house. She claimed the shadowy figure appeared in her bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed and leaning toward her. While it didn't physically harm her, its oppressive presence left her paralyzed with fear. This moment, when the Watcher allegedly crossed from being an observer to entering her personal space, stands out as a chilling example of interaction. Margaret also reported that after moving out, the Watcher seemed to follow her. She would see its shadow at the edge of her yard or reflected in windows. While it never touched her or spoke, the psychological toll of its constant presence deeply affected her. One local legend claims that in the early 1970s, a man named Daniel stayed overnight at the Watcher's house while visiting Point Pleasant. He was a friend of the family living there at the time and had reportedly heard about the strange occurrences but dismissed them as superstition. That night, Daniel woke up to find his bedroom window wide open, though he had locked it before going to sleep. He felt a cold breeze and saw a tall, dark figure standing just outside the window. Thinking it was a burglar, he yelled and ran toward the window, but the figure didn't move. It simply faded into the night. The next morning, Daniel packed his things and left abruptly, refusing to explain why. Weeks later, the family learned that Daniel had gone missing. His car was found abandoned miles away, and no trace of him was ever discovered. While there's no direct evidence linking his disappearance to the Watcher, the timing and his final encounter with the figure have fueled speculation. In the 1980s, a family with young children moved into the Watcher's house. According to their accounts, their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, began talking about the tall man who came to her window at night. She described him as dark and featureless, with no face, but said he would tap on the glass and whisper her name. Her parents initially dismissed it as a nightmare or a child's overactive imagination, until they began hearing the tapping themselves. One night, Emily screamed, claiming the tall man had come into her room. Her parents rushed in to find her huddled in the corner, pointing at the now closed window. The family moved out within a month, and Emily reportedly refused to sleep near a window for years afterward. In the 1990s, a paranormal investigator named James visited Point Pleasant after hearing rumors about the Watcher's house. He was skeptical, but wanted to document any unusual activity. According to his report, he set up a camera facing the front of the house, hoping to catch evidence of the shadowy figure locals described. Around midnight, while reviewing footage on site, James felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He turned to look at the house and saw a figure standing in the upstairs window, watching him. He was certain no one was home, as the house was vacant at the time. As he approached the house, the figure moved away from the window. James entered the building, but when he climbed the stairs to investigate, he heard heavy footsteps behind him, as though someone was following. When he turned, no one was there, but the oppressive feeling remained. He left the house abruptly and later claimed that, for weeks afterward, he felt as though he was being watched, even in his own home. In the 2010s, a local cleaning company was hired to prepare the Watcher's house for a new tenant. One of the workers, Linda, reported that while cleaning the kitchen, she felt like someone was staring at her. When she turned toward the window, she saw a shadowy figure standing outside. Linda assumed it was a prank or one of her co-workers, but when she went outside to confront them, no one was there. Later that afternoon, she was vacuuming an upstairs bedroom when she heard a loud bang from the hallway. She stepped out to investigate and saw all the doors along the hallway slowly swinging open, one after the other. Terrified, Linda left the job unfinished and refused to return. Her co-workers later claimed they also felt uneasy while working in the house, though none experienced anything as dramatic as Linda's encounter. Some locals believe the Watcher isn't malevolent, but rather protective, possibly tied to the land or warning people to stay away. There are stories of people experiencing sudden, inexplicable feelings of dread or nausea when approaching the house, as though being pushed away by an unseen force. One story involves a couple who planned to break into the house as part of a dare in the early 2000s. As they approached the property, they both stopped abruptly, overcome by the sensation that they were being watched. Moments later, they heard footsteps on the porch behind them, though no one was there. Shaken, they abandoned their plan to enter the house. They later claimed that the Watcher saved them from something worse inside. While most stories about the Watcher involve indirect interaction, such as being watched or hearing footsteps, there are enough accounts of physical presence, like sitting on a bed or tapping on windows, to suggest the entity crosses into the realm of direct contact. Whether the Watcher is a spirit, a shadow person, or a projection of human fear, its ability to instill dread and unease is undeniable. These stories remain unverified, blending folklore with anecdotal evidence, but they serve as a chilling reminder that sometimes the feeling of being watched might not just be in your head. The haunting of Blackwood Asylum. Blackwood Asylum stood at the edge of the dense Virginia woods, abandoned for decades, its crumbling brick walls swallowed by unrelenting vines. Locals called it the Wailing House, for those who ventured too close claimed they could hear faint cries echoing from within its decaying halls. Though the asylum was officially closed in 1965, its dark history remained alive in whispers of the townfolk. Its story was infamous. Built in 1902, Blackwood was originally a refuge for the mentally ill, but its reputation quickly soured as reports of abuse, mistreatment, and mysterious deaths surfaced. Patients went missing, and staff met untimely ends. Official investigations were few and inconclusive, and the building was shuttered after a massive fire that claimed the lives of nearly 50 patients and staff. But rumors persisted, whispers of a doctor who had performed unspeakable experiments in the basement, of patients who never left their padded cells, and of something unnatural lurking in the shadows. By the time a group of amateur ghost hunters decided to investigate Blackwood in 2012, its legend had grown beyond reason. The group, led by 22-year-old college student Lisa Harper, wasn't expecting much. Just some creepy photos, a bit of adrenaline, and a story to tell their friends. What they found, however, was far more than they bargained for. Lisa Harper had always been fascinated by the paranormal. As a child, she spent hours poring over books about ghosts, hauntings, and unexplained phenomena. But her interest wasn't just idle curiosity, it was personal. Her grandmother, who had grown up in the Appalachian Mountains, often told tales of spirits that wandered the woods, of lights that danced in the valleys at night, and of the strange things that happened when the wind howled just right. One story in particular stuck with Lisa, the tale of the Blackwood Asylum. Her grandmother's voice would drop to a whisper whenever she mentioned it. "That place is cursed," she'd say, her weathered hands clutching her rosary. "You don't go near Blackwood. Not ever. There's something there that don't rest." Now, years later, Lisa found herself unable to resist the pull of the asylum. When her friend Josh suggested they investigate it for his paranormal YouTube channel, she didn't hesitate. It felt like fate. "I'm in," Lisa said, her heart racing with a mix of excitement and trepidation. By the end of the week, their team was assembled. Lisa, Josh, the self-proclaimed tech expert, Rachel, a skeptic with a sharp wit, and Derek, the muscle, though he was more bark than bite. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a few basic ghost hunting gadgets, they set out for Blackwood on a chilly October night. The drive to Blackwood was uneventful, but the atmosphere changed as they neared the asylum. The road narrowed, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, and a heavy silence settled over the group. Even Rachel, who had been cracking jokes the entire drive, grew quiet. When the asylum came into view, it took their breath away. The building loomed like a sleeping beast, its jagged silhouette outlined against the moonlit sky. Broken windows stared back at them like hollow eyes, and the main door hung slightly ajar as if inviting them in. "Well, this is cheerful," Rachel muttered, breaking the silence. Josh parked the car, and they unloaded their gear. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the woods were empty, or so it seemed. "Ready?" Josh asked, his voice too loud in the stillness. Lisa nodded, gripping her flashlight tightly. "Let's do this." The inside of the asylum was worse than they'd imagined. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and their footsteps echoed ominously in the cavernous halls. Graffiti covered the walls, and broken furniture lay scattered across the floors. But it wasn't just the physical decay that unnerved them. It was the feeling of the place. It felt alive, as though the building itself was watching them. They began their exploration on the first floor, which had once housed administrative offices. Josh set up a camera in the main hallway while Derek and Rachel examined the rooms. "Hey, check this out," Derek called. He was standing in what had once been the director's office, holding a dusty file folder. "Patient records." Lisa joined him, her curiosity piqued. She flipped through the yellowed pages, her eyes scanning the faded text. One name caught her attention: Eleanor Gray. Eleanor Gray, she read aloud. Admitted in 1937, diagnosed with severe hysteria and hallucinations. "What happened to her?" Rachel asked, peering over Lisa's shoulder. Lisa turned the page. "Deceased. Cause of death? Unknown." A chill ran down her spine. Something about Eleanor's name felt familiar, though she couldn't place it. "Guys," Josh called from the hallway, "you need to see this." They followed him to the staircase leading to the second floor. The walls were covered in scratches, as though someone or something had clawed at them desperately. The marks were deep and jagged, and they stretched all the way up the stairs. "Okay, that's freaky," Rachel admitted. Josh grinned, his camera trained on the scratches. "Freaky is good. Freaky gets views." Lisa wasn't so sure. She felt a growing unease, as though they were intruding on something they didn't understand. But she pushed the feeling aside and followed the group upstairs. The second floor was darker, colder, and eerier than the first. This was where the patients had been housed, and the remnants of their lives were everywhere. Rusted bed frames, torn mattresses, and faintly scrawled messages on the walls. Most were illegible, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over: "She's coming." "Who's she?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. They split up to cover more ground, each armed with a flashlight and a walkie-talkie. Lisa found herself drawn to a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and the air inside felt colder than the rest of the floor. She stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the wall behind it, someone had written a name in bold black letters: Eleanor Gray. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. "Guys!" she shouted, pounding on the door. "Let me out!" There was no response. Her flashlight flickered, and the temperature plummeted. She could see her breath now, and the air was filled with a faint whispering. It seemed to come from all around her, dozens of voices overlapping in an unintelligible chorus. And then she saw it, a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadow, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. She took a step toward Lisa, her movements jerky and inhuman. Lisa screamed. The others found Lisa moments later, huddled in the corner of the room, pale and shaking. She tried to explain what she'd seen, but her words came out in panicked gasps. "It was her," she whispered. "Eleanor Gray." Josh looked skeptical, but Rachel and Derek seemed genuinely frightened. "Maybe we should leave," Rachel suggested. "No way," Josh said. "We've barely scratched the surface. Besides, we've got this on camera, right?" He checked his recorder, but the footage was blank, static. His face fell. Lisa didn't argue. She didn't care about the footage or the YouTube channel. She just wanted to get out of Blackwood. But as they made their way back down the stairs, the whispers began again, louder this time. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to move. "Did you hear that?" Derek asked, his voice trembling. Then, the lights on their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The darkness was complete, swallowing them like a living thing. Lisa clutched her flashlight, frantically clicking the switch, but it refused to turn back on. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't random anymore. They sounded like voices, overlapping and coming from all directions. "Josh?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. She reached out blindly, her hand brushing against a wall. "Where are you?" "I'm here." Josh's voice came from somewhere to her right. "Everyone stay calm. Just stay where you are." "Stay calm?" Rachel's voice was sharp, teetering on panic. "We're stuck in a haunted asylum in pitch black and you want us to." She stopped abruptly. The whispering had changed. It wasn't distant anymore. It was up close, too close, as if someone were standing right behind them, breathing in their ears. "Who's there?" Derek's voice boomed, but it cracked with fear. No one answered. A loud bang echoed through the asylum, the sound of a door slamming shut somewhere deep within the building. The group froze. Their breaths caught in their throats. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, like boots on concrete. They echoed through the halls, growing louder and closer. Lisa fumbled for her walkie-talkie. "Josh, what's going on?" she whispered into it, though he was only a few feet away. Static. Then a voice, not Josh's, answered. "She's here." The walkie-talkie crackled, and the line went dead. Panic set in. Lisa grabbed Josh's arm in the darkness, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave. Now." "I'm trying," Josh hissed, fumbling with his camera. Its tiny screen flickered to life, providing a dim glow that cast long, jittery shadows on the walls. "I think the exit's this way." "No," Lisa said quickly, shaking her head. "That's not right. We came from the other direction." "Are you sure?" Josh asked, but before Lisa could answer, Rachel screamed. "Something touched me," she shrieked, stumbling backward. "I swear to God, something grabbed my leg." Derek hurried to her, shining the dim light from his phone on the floor. "There's nothing here," he said, though his voice wavered. But Lisa saw it, the faint impression of a handprint pressed into the dust near Rachel's foot. It wasn't human. The fingers were too long, the palm too narrow, the shape warped and unnatural. The footsteps began again, louder this time, echoing from the direction of the main hall. "We're not alone," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Josh gritted his teeth. "We'll head downstairs," he decided. "Maybe there's another way out, a broken window, a back door, something." Lisa hesitated. Every instinct told her not to go deeper into the asylum, but the footsteps were closing in, and they had no other choice. The group moved as quickly as they could, their adrenaline pushing them forward. The stairwell to the basement was narrow and steep, the metal steps slick with moisture. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of mildew was replaced by something far worse, a sickly, rancid odor that made Lisa gag. "What is that smell?" Rachel asked, covering her nose with her sleeve. "Death," Derek muttered grimly. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long, low-ceilinged hallway lined with heavy steel doors. Most were rusted shut, but a few hung open, revealing small, windowless rooms with chains bolted to the walls. It didn't take much imagination to guess what they had been used for. "This is a holding area," Josh said, his voice tinged with awe and horror, "for the dangerous patients. Or the ones they didn't want anyone to know about," Lisa added, her stomach turning. She felt a deep sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were watching her. One door at the far end of the hall stood out. It was larger than the others, and unlike the rest, it was pristine, its surface gleaming as though it had been freshly polished. "That's not right," Rachel said, shaking her head. "Nothing else down here looks like that." Josh approached it cautiously, his camera rolling. "It's probably a storage room or something," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Lisa hung back, her heart pounding. "Don't open it." But Josh didn't listen. He reached for the handle, and the moment his fingers touched the metal, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices screaming inside their heads. "Josh, stop!" Lisa shouted, but it was too late. He turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was unlike anything they had seen before. It was immaculate, starkly white, and brightly lit by an unnatural, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars containing murky liquid. Inside the jars were things, organs, bones, and other things that defied description. Lisa's stomach churned as she realized some of them weren't human. In the center of the room stood a single operating table, its surface stained with old dried blood. Rusted surgical instruments lay scattered around it, saws, scalpels, and devices whose purpose Lisa didn't want to imagine. This is where it happened," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "The experiments." "What experiments?" Derek asked, his face pale. Lisa swallowed hard, her mind racing. "There were stories about a doctor who worked here, Dr. Alistair Crow. They said he wasn't treating the patients, he was experimenting on them, trying to cure madness by—" She broke off, unable to continue. "By what?" Rachel pressed, though her voice was barely audible. "By cutting it out," Lisa finished, her stomach turning. Josh scanned the room with his camera, his hands trembling. "This is insane," he muttered. "We need to." The door slammed shut behind them, cutting him off. The lights flickered violently, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar. Then all at once, everything went silent, and that's when they saw her. She stood in the corner of the room, her back to them, her body shrouded in shadow. Her head twitched unnaturally, jerking from side to side as though she were struggling to control her movements. Slowly she began to turn, and Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Eleanor Gray's face was a nightmare. Her eyes were hollow sockets, black and endless, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that stretched far too wide. Her skin was pale and cracked, like old porcelain, and her limbs moved with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. "She's coming." The phrase echoed in Lisa's mind, repeated over and over, and she realized it wasn't just a memory. It was Eleanor's voice speaking directly to her. "Run," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to run." But no one moved. They were frozen, paralyzed by fear, as Eleanor took a step forward. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the lights dimmed until only her figure was visible, bathed in a sickly, unnatural glow. Then she screamed. The sound was inhuman, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It shattered the silence and broke their paralysis. Lisa grabbed Josh's arm and yanked him toward the door, which had somehow swung open again. "Go!" she screamed. "Go! Go!" The group bolted, racing back down the hallway and up the stairs, the sound of Eleanor's wailing echoing behind them. The asylum seemed to come alive, the walls groaning and the floors trembling beneath their feet. Doors slammed shut as they passed, and shadows darted in the corners of their vision. When they reached the main floor, they didn't stop. They ran for the exit, their lungs burning and their hearts pounding. But the front door was gone. "What the hell?" Derek shouted, spinning around. "It was right here!" "It's the asylum," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "It won't let us leave." The wailing grew louder, and the shadows began to coalesce, forming shapes that reached for them with long, skeletal fingers. "We're gonna die here," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, we won't," Lisa said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Keep moving. There has to be another way out." The wailing grew louder, reverberating through the asylum like a siren from the depths of hell. The walls seemed to shift, stretching and twisting, as if the building itself were alive, warping its very structure to trap them. Lisa gripped Rachel's hand, pulling her through a side hallway. The others followed, their frantic footsteps echoing in the suffocating darkness. The shadows that had been forming moments ago were no longer just shapes. They were humanoid figures now, writhing and crawling along the walls and ceilings, their eyeless faces fixed in expressions of torment. "Keep moving!" Lisa shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers and wails. "This isn't real!" Rachel screamed, her voice breaking. "This can't be happening." "It's real," Derek muttered, his voice hollow. "It's all real." Josh stopped abruptly at a fork in the hall, spinning around with his camera still clutched in his hands. "Which way? Which way? We're going in circles." Lisa hesitated, her breath coming in short gasps. Both hallways looked identical, stretching into endless darkness. Her instincts screamed at her to choose the left corridor, but before she could speak, the right hallway flickered with light, a faint, unnatural glow, like the one they'd seen in the basement. "No," Lisa whispered. "Not that way." Josh, however, was already moving toward the light. "There's something there. Maybe it's an exit." "Josh, stop!" Lisa shouted, but he didn't listen. The group had no choice but to follow him, their footsteps reluctant. The glow grew brighter as they advanced, and the air grew colder, denser. The hallway ended in a massive iron door, its surface scarred with deep gouges as though something had tried to claw its way through. "Josh, don't open it," Lisa pleaded, grabbing his arm. He turned to her, his expression wild. "What other choice do we have? We can't stay here!" Before Lisa could stop him, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was enormous, far larger than it should have been, given the size of the asylum. Its walls were covered in mirrors, each one cracked and tarnished, reflecting distorted images of the group as they entered. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the floor was slick with a dark, sticky substance that clung to their shoes. In the center of the room stood a figure. At first, it appeared to be human, but as they approached, it became clear that it was something else entirely. Its body was made of faces, hundreds of them, fused together in a grotesque patchwork. Some were contorted in agony, others frozen in silent screams. Their eyes moved independently, following the group as they stepped closer. Lisa's stomach churned and she stumbled back, nearly losing her balance. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The thing didn't move, but its faces began to speak, their voices overlapping in a nightmarish chorus. "Help us," they whispered. "Set us free." Lisa's legs felt like jelly, but something compelled her to step closer. She could feel the pain radiating from the creature, an overwhelming wave of sorrow and desperation. It wasn't just one entity. It was hundreds, maybe thousands, trapped together in eternal torment. "Lisa, get back!" Derek shouted, grabbing her arm. "We need to get out of here!" But the creature's voices grew louder, and one of its faces, a woman's face, pale and cracked, turned to Lisa. It was Eleanor Gray. "You brought them here," Eleanor's voice said, though her lips didn't move. "You opened the door. Now you must pay the price." Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I didn't know." The creature began to move, its fused bodies jerking and writhing as it turned toward the group. Its many eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light, and the air grew impossibly cold. The mirrors on the walls began to vibrate, their surfaces rippling like water. "Run!" Lisa screamed. They bolted for the door, but the room had changed. Instead of leading back into the hallway, the door opened into another room, identical to the first. More mirrors lined the walls, and their reflections stared back at them with expressions of horror that didn't match their own. "This isn't real," Rachel whimpered, clutching her head. "This isn't—" "Keep it together," Derek barked, grabbing her arm. "We're getting out of here." But the asylum wasn't done with them. The mirrors began to shatter, one by one, sending jagged shards flying through the air. Lisa ducked, covering her head, but she could hear the others screaming as the glass sliced through the air. When she looked up, she was alone. "Josh? Derek? Rachel?" Her voice echoed in the empty room, but there was no response. The mirrors were whole again, and her reflection stared back at her, wide-eyed and trembling. Then her reflection moved. Lisa froze. The figure in the mirror was no longer mimicking her movements. It was watching her, its head tilting at an unnatural angle. Slowly, it raised a hand and pointed to something behind her. Lisa turned, her heart pounding. Eleanor Gray was there, standing just inches away. Eleanor's hollow eyes bored into Lisa's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The asylum fell silent, the air heavy with dread. Then, without warning, Eleanor's hand shot out, grabbing Lisa's wrist. Her touch was ice cold, and Lisa's vision blurred as the world around her shifted. She was no longer in the asylum. She was in a hospital room, stark and sterile, with Eleanor lying on a bed. Her body was frail, and her face was twisted in pain. A man stood over her, his face obscured by shadows, holding a scalpel. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice weak. "Don't do this." "You're sick, Eleanor," the man said, his tone cold and detached. "I'm going to make you better." Lisa realized with a sickening jolt that she was seeing the past, the truth of what had happened at Blackwood. The man wasn't treating Eleanor, he was experimenting on her, cutting into her mind and body in a twisted attempt to cure her madness. The vision shifted again, and Lisa saw the fire, the flames engulfing the asylum, the patients screaming as they were trapped inside. Eleanor was among them, her body consumed by the fire as she reached out for someone, anyone, to save her. Lisa gasped as she was thrust back into the present. She was on the floor of the mirror room, Eleanor standing over her. "They must pay," Eleanor hissed, her voice echoing with rage. "All of them, and so must you." "No," Lisa whispered, shaking her head. "I'm not like them. I didn't hurt you." Eleanor's face twisted into a grotesque grin. "But you brought them here. You opened the door." Lisa scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She had to find the others, had to get them out of this nightmare. But Eleanor wasn't done with her. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming into monstrous shapes that lunged at her with clawed hands. Lisa ran, her heart pounding, the walls of the asylum shifting and closing in around her. She found Josh first, slumped against a wall, his camera clutched in his hands. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. "Josh!" Lisa shook him, but he didn't respond. His camera screen flickered, showing grainy footage of Eleanor standing over him, her hands pressed against his chest. Lisa realized with horror that he wasn't breathing. "No, no, no!" she cried, but there was no time to mourn. The shadows were closing in, and she had to keep moving. She found Rachel and Derek in the main hall, both of them huddled together, their faces streaked with tears. "We have to go!" Lisa shouted, grabbing their arms. "Now, but Josh," Rachel began, but Lisa cut her off. "He's gone. We can't help him." The three of them ran, the asylum's wails growing louder and more desperate. The front door appeared ahead of them, but it was blocked by a figure, Eleanor. "You can't leave," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You're mine now." Lisa stepped forward, her fear replaced by a surge of determination. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice steady. "You can let us go. You can find peace." Eleanor hesitated, her hollow eyes narrowing. For a moment, Lisa thought she had reached her. But then Eleanor screamed, and the shadows surged forward. Lisa grabbed Rachel and Derek's hands and ran straight for the door. The shadows clawed at them, pulling at their clothes and skin, but they didn't stop. With a final burst of strength, they crashed through the door and into the cold night air. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. They piled in, and Derek floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the asylum. None of them spoke, their minds too numb to process what had happened. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, Lisa looked back. Blackwood Asylum stood in the distance, its silhouette dark and foreboding. For a moment, she thought she saw Eleanor standing in one of the windows, watching them. They never spoke about what happened that night. Josh's disappearance was ruled an accident, and the footage on his camera was too corrupted to make sense of. But Lisa knew the truth. Eleanor Gray was still there, waiting for her next visitors, and Blackwood Asylum would never rest. Months later, Lisa sat alone in her apartment, trying to move on. But sometimes late at night, she would hear the whispers again, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "She's coming." Lisa would close her eyes and pray that it wasn't true. But deep down, she knew Eleanor wasn't finished with her. Not yet. Lisa Harper hadn't slept properly in weeks. Every time she closed her eyes, the asylum came rushing back. The whispers, the shadows, Eleanor Gray. The memory of her hollow, eyeless face was etched into her mind, and Lisa could still feel the icy grip of her hand around her wrist. But it wasn't just nightmares haunting Lisa. It was the strange things happening in her waking life. At first, it was subtle. Lights flickered in her apartment, shadows seemed to stretch further than they should, and objects weren't where she remembered leaving them. She brushed it off as stress, a side effect of the trauma she'd endured. But as the days turned into weeks, the incidents grew harder to ignore. One night, while brushing her teeth, Lisa caught movement in the mirror. Her reflection didn't move with her. It stood frozen, staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. She turned to look behind her, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was normal again. She dropped the toothbrush and backed out of the bathroom, her heart racing. By the time she crawled into bed that night, she'd convinced herself it was just her imagination. But as she drifted off to sleep, she heard a faint whisper, familiar and chilling. "She's coming." Lisa sat bolt upright, her chest heaving. The room was dark and silent, but the words lingered in her ears. She turned on every light in her apartment and didn't sleep again that night. Rachel's decline. Rachel fared no better. After leaving Blackwood, she became increasingly withdrawn, snapping at her friends and family whenever they asked what was wrong. She refused to talk about the asylum, brushing it off as just a stupid mistake, but her pale, gaunt face told a different story. At night, she was plagued by vivid nightmares. She dreamed of the asylum's endless halls, of Eleanor Gray standing at the foot of her bed, her eyeless face staring down at her. But the nightmares weren't the worst part. It was the feeling of being watched during the day, of something lurking just out of sight. Rachel started hearing things, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, they were faint, almost imperceptible, but as the days went on, they grew louder. She would hear her name called when she was alone in her apartment or feel a cold breath on the back of her neck. No matter where she went, the feeling of being followed never left her. One night, Rachel woke to find her bedroom door wide open. She was certain she had closed it before going to bed. As she got up to shut it, she caught a glimpse of something in the hallway, a pale figure, standing motionless in the dark. She slammed the door and locked it, her hands trembling. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night. A week later, Rachel disappeared. Her parents reported her missing, but no trace of her was ever found. The only clue was her phone, left behind on her nightstand. Its screen was cracked, and the last recorded note was a voice memo. The audio was garbled, filled with static, but one phrase was clear: "She's here." Derek's breakdown. Derek tried to move on, burying himself in his work and avoiding any mention of Blackwood. But the experience had left a mark on him, one he couldn't shake. He started drinking heavily, trying to numb the constant feeling of dread that followed him everywhere. At night, he would wake up in a cold sweat, convinced he could hear Eleanor's wail echoing in his ears. One night, Derek's coworkers invited him out for drinks, hoping to cheer him up. He reluctantly agreed, desperate for some semblance of normalcy. But as he sat in the crowded bar, surrounded by laughter and conversation, he felt completely alone. The shadows in the room seemed darker than they should be, and he kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye. Excusing himself to the restroom, Derek splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection in the mirror. His hollow, bloodshot eyes stared back at him, but behind his reflection, he saw something else. Eleanor, standing silently in the corner of the room, her twisted grin stretching impossibly wide. Derek stumbled backward, turning to face the corner, but it was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, Eleanor was gone, but her voice whispered in his ears, "You can't escape." That night, Derek drove home drunk, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't see the truck coming until it was too late. The crash was devastating, and Derek was killed instantly. When paramedics arrived, they found something strange. The driver's seat was ice cold, despite the warm summer night, and etched into the cracked windshield, as if by invisible fingers, was a single word: mine. Lisa's descent. Lisa learned about Derek's death and Rachel's disappearance a week later. The news shattered her. She had tried to reach out to both of them after the asylum, but they had pushed her away, saying they needed space. Now they were both gone, and she was alone. The events at Blackwood had left her with a deep sense of guilt. She had been the one to agree to the investigation, to bring the group to that cursed place. And now it seemed the asylum, or Eleanor Gray, wasn't finished with her. The strange occurrences in her apartment escalated. Objects moved on their own, her lights flickered constantly, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. One night, her TV turned on by itself, the screen displaying nothing but static. Through the static, Lisa thought she could see faces, twisted, screaming faces. She tried to leave, packing a bag and driving to a friend's house, but the whispers followed her there too. Wherever she went, the shadows seemed to stretch toward her, and the feeling of being watched never left. In a desperate attempt to find answers, Lisa began researching Blackwood Asylum. She pored over old newspaper articles, medical records, and eyewitness accounts, trying to piece together the truth about Eleanor Gray and the horrors that had taken place there. What she discovered only deepened her fear. Eleanor Gray wasn't the only victim of Dr. Alistair Crow's experiments. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. Many of them had died in agony, and their restless spirits were said to haunt the asylum, trapped there by the violent energy of their deaths. But Eleanor was different. She hadn't just died, she had become something else, something far worse. The fire that consumed her body had unleashed her spirit, transforming her into a vengeful entity that fed on fear and suffering. Lisa realized the truth too late. Eleanor wasn't just haunting Blackwood. She had attached herself to Lisa, following her out of the asylum, and now there was no escape. One cold December night, Lisa sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the research she had gathered. She had tried everything to rid herself of Eleanor, cleansing rituals, priests, psychics, but nothing had worked. The whispers were louder than ever, and the shadows in her apartment seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. As midnight approached, Lisa felt the temperature drop. Her breath fogged in the air, and the lights in her apartment flickered violently before going out. She lit a candle, her hands trembling, and sat in the center of the room. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me, Eleanor? I'm not afraid." The whispering stopped. For a moment there was silence, and Lisa dared to hope that it was over. Then she heard it, the wailing. It started softly, but it grew louder, filling the apartment with an ear-splitting shriek. The shadows surged toward her, and Lisa felt an icy hand close around her throat. She gasped for air, her vision blurring, as Eleanor's face appeared before her, a twisted, grinning nightmare. "You're mine now," Eleanor whispered. The candle went out. Lisa Harper's body was found 3 days later. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the paramedics who discovered her body reported strange phenomena. The room was freezing cold, despite the heater being on full blast, and Lisa's face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. On her bedroom mirror, written in frost, were 2 words, "She's free." The case remains unsolved, but those who knew Lisa believe one thing: Eleanor Gray is still out there, and she's waiting for her next victim.